So the film has been rated for violence, coarse language, and some drug use. I've got to say, there actually isn't a whole lot of violence in the film. I mean, I understand why it's earned its rating, but I think it's the language is actually probably the strongest content-related thing in the film, which has raised red flags by the classification boards. So, but let me start with the violence, because there isn't a whole lot to actually mention. Even though this film is very much about the Iraq War, or servicemen, US servicemen going to the Iraq War, and the kind of PTSD-like effects that they suffer as a result, and certainly, you know, as a result of what they see when they're there aren't that many scenes which actually take place in battle. So while you see a lot of people in soldiers and soldier uniforms, you don't see a whole lot of conflict going on, surprisingly. Particularly given the subject matter of the film, I thought there would have been much more, you know, heavy kind of combat scenes, and there really isn't. So the ones that you do see, there is one scene, and probably the most graphic scene, let me just get that one right out of the way. The most graphic scene is you do see somebody being stabbed. Even though you see the knife, you see the victim dying, you don't really see the knife going in, but you know that that is what has happened. So I think probably the most upsetting or potentially inflammatory part about this scene is that the camera very much focuses on the victim as they die. This happens a few times in the film where the camera focuses on the person as they die. So you pretty much watch the life go out of their eyes. There's a little bit of blood and gore. Well, not really gore, just blood related to this scene as well. You see some pooling blood underneath the person to signify that they have been quite badly injured. And you see a little bit of blood spatter, blood on people's hands, but that's it. It really isn't a very bloody film at all, and certainly not very gory. So the other kind of violent scenes, you see a home invasion. This is again in war, so you see a family being a little bit terrorized and someone being, you know, handcuffed and taken away, and they're hooded as well. But again, that's mostly it, and particularly in terms of the war-based scenes. The other violence happens stateside, and you see there's a bit of, you know, wrestling and push and shove goes on between a few people. You see a group of people being jumped, and when they're jumped, you know, they're kind of wrestled and thrown to the ground and ridiculed, that sort of stuff. You don't see anybody really getting hurt. You hardly even really see any punches or kicks thrown, although you understand that there's this scuffle that takes place. And finally, there's one scene when a kind of a derogatory comment is made to one of our characters, and so they lean over and put this man in a headlock. And it's supposed to be a little bit of a joke that goes too far. The person in the headlock ends up passing out, sort of going unconscious for a while. They're okay, but again, it's just one of those tense scenes which, you know, has been flagged under the violence radar. But in terms of overall violence, I think that really is it. What I do want to say is, obviously, you know, given the subject matter of this film, it focuses very much on triggers and emotional triggers, and also physical triggers that happen as a response to having been in war. So fireworks and pyrotechnics and all that kind of stuff, the relationship is very obviously, sometimes a bit heavy-handedly shown that, you know, fireworks sounds like gunfire or explosions, and this can cause soldiers to be upset post-war because it does trigger those flashbacks. So this is a theme which is quite concurrent throughout the film. You see this quite regularly. So let's move on to the drug use. There's a little bit of drug use. You see three men sharing a cigarette, which you understand, even though it isn't stated, you understand that it's a marijuana cigarette. And this is a very brief scene. It isn't really lingered upon, and you don't really even see any effects of these guys smoking the drug. But yeah, the scene's in there. The only other drug-related scene is that somebody takes an Advil for a headache, I assume. And they mention a few times through the film that they'd like some Advil tablets. But yeah, that's really the only drug-related reference other than the joint in the whole film. Onto the sex and nudity in the film. There's quite a bit of, well, there's not really nudity. I mean, you see a lot of like shirtless men. I mean, some scenes take place in a locker room, you know, with men in towels and stuff like that. So, you know, and likewise, there's, you know, the Dallas Cowboys have their cheerleaders. The girls are there, and of course they're in quite skimpy dancewear and skimpy costumes. So you see a bit of cleavage and midriffs and those kind of things. There is one sex scene that takes place. It's a flash forward scene. It isn't really a kind of a sex scene as such. You see a couple in bed together. They seem to be nude, even though you don't see any genitals or anything. And it's very quick. Again, it's just someone imagining what it would be like to sleep with somebody else. So there's this very quick flash forward scene of this couple in bed, obviously having sex. But that's the only sex scene in the film. The other sex-related content is there's a lot of banter and sexual-themed name-calling and insults in the film, everything from mofos to all sorts of other stuff. Most of it's listed on the website if you want to take a closer look. And there's one scene, again, it's just a imagination where someone's asked a question and someone imagines that everyone answers by saying that how they fill their time is by masturbating, and he sees them all saying, yeah, we masturbate, and sort of jerking off towards the camera with their hands to I guess, emphasize the point. So, but again, it's just someone visualizing this in their head. It doesn't sort of take place, if that makes sense. But that, again, that's all the sex in the film. Probably the main thing is the language. The language is pretty heavy in the film. There's a lot of F words and S words and A words. And as I said, there's heaps of those insults, all those kind of, mofo-related and genital-related insults. They're very heavy in the film, which, probably isn't surprising. I mean, these are young, sort of 19-plus years of age soldiers who like to trash talk. So there's quite a bit of that. Quite heavily through the film. So this is why it's been flagged for coarse language. In terms of the enjoyment of the film overall, this is a really fascinating film. And I have to say, I've never really seen anything like it. Technically, it's just astounding. The technical achievements here, I mean, it's been well documented already that it was shot at 250 frames per second and in 4K. So the technical achievement is extraordinary. The problem I have is that I'm not sure if it's the right story that Ang Lee chose in order to demonstrate this technical prowess, this genius. The story doesn't really live up to I guess the technical standard, only because it's a bit slow, it's a bit circular, not a whole lot happens, and even though it's really interesting, I think this film will cause a lot of upset for a lot of viewers, particularly Americans, because it does really challenge the idea of, we send our young troops off to fight battle. They're pretty unprepared, really, for what they go into. And then we kind of expect them to come home and then get a pat on the back, like, thanks for your service. And the real psychology of that isn't really addressed. I mean, they get these random people come up to them and saying, yeah, that's amazing. My brother fought and that's great. And it just seems very empty. When in this film anyway, it presents it as an empty statement because people do they really understand what these guys have gone through and how it affects you in so many ways. So it addresses all that sort of stuff, and I think that will certainly divide some viewers. I found it intriguing because I think that's an issue that isn't very well handled on screen usually, or it isn't very frequently handled. So it's really great to see that being discussed. The framing and everything I found extraordinary. Sometimes you do actually get characters or actors who are talking directly down the lens. Again, this is a very risky technique. Whether or not it pays off, I'm not entirely sure, particularly in some scenes where you get so distracted by the fact that you're looking at an actor that you kind of lose the flow of the monologue a little bit that's going on because you're sort of too busy looking at the actor. And the reason that you get so busy looking at the actors on screen is because the way that it has been shot, you see a very warts and all kind of close-up of each of the actors, particularly when some people are speaking and they're speaking down the lens, and you can see pimples and you can see wrinkles and crease lines and everything. It's this is what people really look like. Now, if you know anything about me, you know that I'm a massive advocate of this. I love seeing people that look realistic on screen. I don't like all that makeup. I don't like girls who are underfed and men who are overcooked and that sort of stuff on screen. I like seeing people as we really do look like in the real world. So this I found intriguing and fascinating and very satisfying and successful in the film. But for other people, I think they'll find it a bit distracting. And I've got to say, the idea of how the vapidity of sending soldiers to war, then they come back, we give them that pat on the back, and then it's like, I mean, the fact that these guys are also young and they're actors playing these soldiers, that kind of adds to me a little bit to the insincerity. So I'm not quite kind of sure if that works either. Anyway, if you want to know more about the film, the content anyway, check out the website, which is cinemum.net. If you do see the film, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts, which you can leave in a comment below.